All right, last week we started on this Day of the Lord theme, and we're going to finish with that today, but we got a lot of ground to cover, okay? I was hoping to make it through the Old Testament and how the Old Testament authors and prophets discuss this, but I didn't quite get that far. So we're going to have to move a little bit quicker here today if we're going to finish this. So Amos starts us off with these two woe oracles, and the first one is this big concept of the Day of the Lord. And we got to pause here because this is a theme, it's a meta theme that runs throughout the entire Bible from Exodus all the way to Revelation, and it is massive, and it is very important with understanding the gospel and the way God works in history with his people, okay? So I hope you saw last week, oh, hey, Aaron. Oh, sorry, that was me. That was totally me. Sorry about that. Oh, I'm way behind, actually. Let me get caught up here. Maybe this is skipping a little bit. There we go. So here's where we are. These woe oracles, right after this chiasm that Amos gives us in chapter 5. So I hope you saw last week that this concept of the Day of the Lord starts off in the Torah, and it's really bare bones at first and underdeveloped. But then as it runs through the prophets, they just riff off of this thing like crazy and keep adding to it and materializing it more and more as we get carried along in the Scriptures. Then, at the end of the Old Testament, it's this really big, developed biblical meta-theme, and the Gospels can then take it, pick it up, and just be like, hey, remember all that chatter in the Old Testament about this Day of the Lord concept and this coming Day of the Lord? Well, there's this guy whose name literally means Yahweh saves. And, oh yeah, he's from Nazareth, which means stick or branch town. Right? Remember that one? But he was born in Bethlehem, which is the city of David. And not only is he from the tribe of Judah, but both of his parents are direct descendants from David. And when he touches people, he heals them. But he also makes them clean ceremonially. Right? And then sometimes before he heals people and restores them to completeness, he tells them that their sins are forgiven, right? I mean, I hope you see that I'm barely scratching the surface on this stuff. It's quite amazing. Do you see how all of this stuff is intimately tied together? You can't separate the parts of this story. They're too knitly woven, okay? Everything builds off of the previous thing, and everything contextually just moves forward as the Spirit carries it along. It's quite amazing. So one thing that I forgot to mention last week was this this way Joel roots the Day of the Lord concept that he's talking about. How does he root? How does he root this future Day of the Lord? In verse 16, what does he do? Right before that, it says, "The sun and the moon are darkened; the stars withdraw their light." So he gives us this metaphor of darkness. The sun withdrawing its light, darkness. And then, what does he say? The Lord roars from Zion. He utters his voice from Jerusalem. What is that? It's the first line of Amos. It's Amos. He's telling us about Amos, right? Isn't that funny? Isn't that unique? But isn't it totally anticipated? I mean, doesn't that totally make sense? That he's telling us about this Day of the Lord and he roots it in Amos. And he's saying it's about Moses and it's about Amos, but it's also about something else, right? He picks up this theme that Moses starts and Amos picks up and sort of riffs off and adds to in a very unique way. And then when Joel does it, he adds to it in another unique way. He says it's about Moses, it's about Amos, but it's also about something else. It's about the coming of Yahweh himself personally and dwelling with us personally in Zion. That's the last line of his book. God coming and dwelling with us personally and directly, just like Eden, just like he did in the garden. He's going back to that, right? And we don't see it completely until Revelation 22. But that's what Joel's pointing towards. So you see how Joel shows how this concept has evolved throughout redemptive history and the prophets? And it's the same thing, right? But it's used in more complete and profound ways as we progress through the prophets and ultimately to Jesus. Then we get the restoration of all things and the new heavens and the new earth. So do you see how this day of the Lord is clearly something in the future? But we can only unlock the meaning of that by understanding what God has done in the past. Okay? I'm going to say that again in a little bit different way. To Joel and some of the other prophets, especially post-exile prophets, the future day of the Lord is about what God will do and bring in the future. But it can only be understood in the context of what God has done in the past, specifically in Exodus and redeeming the people of Israel into their land graciously. Okay? And we're going to see that a little bit more completely here. Remember a few weeks ago we were talking about Mark? We were talking about Mark and how Mark gives us all these really cool stories in the beginning third of his book, right? All of these, oh, wait a minute. There we go. All these really cool stories at the beginning third of his book, right? It's amazing. He's doing them for a reason and a purpose, okay? He tells us that Jesus makes the unclean clean by touching them, right? Ceremonial clean, like we see in Leviticus, right? He tells us that Jesus forgives sins. He commands the wind and the waves and creation, the elements of creation. He feeds people in mass in a place where there is no food, right? The desert, right? Like in the wilderness throughout Exodus and Numbers. He hovers over the water like the Ruach, right? What's the first page of the Bible? You have the Ruach, the Spirit of God, hovering over the waters of creation, right? But here, that's how Mark starts his gospel. The Spirit is descending on Jesus as he's in the baptismal waters, right? So you have that same thing going on. The Spirit hovering over the waters. But then 6 chapters later, Jesus is literally hovering over the waters. He's walking on the water, right? The wind and the waves, the waters. The disciples were rowing, vigorously. The wind was prevailing against them, and Jesus is hovering over those waters. And then he speaks, and those waters are calmed, right? I mean, he's doing the same thing that God has done in the Old Testament, time and time and time and time again. Okay? It's amazing. Mark is doing something intentionally here, and very, very uniquely. So what is Mark doing, right? Do you remember a few years ago we looked at the Gospel of Mark? The first third of Mark is split into thirds, okay? The first third is it's often called Acts 1, 2, and 3. 3 different distinct parts of Mark, okay? And he chooses, 3 parts. It's fitting, isn't it? 3 parts. And the first part is addressing this question, who Jesus is. And when he addresses that question, who Jesus is, he gives us all these stories of Jesus doing the things that only God does in the Old Testament. So when these people, I don't have it up here. When these people let me hold off on that for a minute. So how do we know that Mark is proclaiming Jesus to be Yahweh incarnate? We know that from history, from the Old Testament, from the Torah, from the prophets, because God has done all of those things before. The same things that Jesus is doing here in the opening pages, the first third of Mark, right? And then we're given this line at the end of this whole section, that says, "And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves," because their hearts were hardened. They didn't understand about, not just the loaves, but all these miracles. They didn't understand them. Why? They didn't understand what Jesus is doing here. They're just seeing these miracles as, wow, these things are miraculous, right? They didn't understand that Jesus was literally doing the things that God did for the people of Israel in the wilderness in that case. But he's also doing the thing that God did in the waters of creation. And he's also doing the things that he did in Leviticus, making the people clean, right? By touching them, right? That's the meaning of, when Jesus turns the water into wine, it's pretty cool. But that miracle has meaning behind it, okay? The point is not the miracles. The point is the meaning of the miracles. The point is Emmanuel, God with us, or Jesus, God saves us. Or as Jeremiah puts it, Yahweh is our righteousness, okay? So coming back to this day of the Lord in Amos, to Moses, God judges the Egyptians and saves his covenantal people. But to Amos, God judges his covenantal people, his chosen people, because they have become Egypt. And now to Joel, God is judging evil, the serpent, these types, these seeds of the serpent, right? And he's restoring all things to Eden, where he directly dwells with his creation and his people. And that's literally the last line of Joel here. Do you see how these prophets are taking us through these big concepts and these themes? It's quite amazing. So just real quick, I want to look at Zechariah. Okay, because this is totally related to Amos too. Now, we've already looked at this, right? Now, look at verse 4. On that day, this day of the Lord, this coming day of the Lord, on that day he shall stand on the Mount of Olives. He'll put his feet on the Mount of Olives before Jerusalem, which is on the east. Right? We've already talked about that. Where did Jesus ascend to heaven? The Mount of Olives. Where did he come into Jerusalem and look on the city and weep? The Mount of Olives. Zechariah is talking about the day of Ezekiel, right? When Yahweh took up in the chariot and left the temple. And when he left the temple, he stopped at the Mount of Olives and he looked over the city and then he left. Zechariah is talking about that, but he's talking about a day in the future as well. He's talking about Jesus, okay? When Yahweh comes back to the Mount of Olives. Isn't that amazing? But when Zechariah roots this coming day of the Lord, what does he do? In verse 5, Tom pointed this out to me a few months ago or whatever when we were going through the congregational Bible reading, right? Because he's a little bit ahead. So he gave me a heads up, which I appreciate. How does Zechariah root this coming day of the Lord? What does he say? And he uses a metaphor. This day of the Lord is going to be like a metaphor. And what is his metaphor in verse 5? And you shall flee as you fled from the what? Earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. When was that? How does Amos start his book? The earthquake that happened in the days of Uzziah. He's tipping his hat, in a way, to the first prophet to pick up this concept of the day of the Lord and riff off of it in a meaningful way, right? Moses started it in Exodus, but Amos picks it up and he adds to it in a meaningful way and says, it's not just that, it's something else. And Zechariah says, it's not just Moses and it's not just Amos, but there's more. He's going to put his feet on the Mount of Olives. That's crazy, isn't it? This has happened 500 years before Jesus put his feet on the Mount of Olives. All right? This is amazing. So I just wanted to mention that briefly. The last place I want to go is Malachi. Now, this is how the Old Testament ends. Malachi is the last book in the Old Testament, but not coincidentally, it's the last. He's the last prophet. This is the last guy that God spoke to. Okay, chronologically as well. Now, he does this. He uses this day of the Lord in a very unique way as well. Similar, but unique, right? Now, what is this? The verse 1 of the second last chapter in the Old Testament. Behold, I am sending my messenger, and he will prepare your way before me. Do you recognize that? Yep. But he's not quoting from Mark, right? He's quoting from Moses. This is from Exodus 23. This messenger that goes before the people of God into the land of Canaan, right? Would you say that's the day of the Lord? God giving graciously the people this land, right? Restoring them, right? This is restorative justice, right? He did the retributive justice to the Egyptians, and then he restored the immigrants, the people of God. They were immigrants at the time. They were slaves. They were the sojourners, right? He's restoring them. This is the day of the Lord, okay? So that's how he's rooting this. He's rooting it in Moses, okay? So that's what he's doing in verse 1. That's how he provides context, okay? It's a direct quote from Exodus 23. And then in verse 3, look what he does. Well, the end of verse 2, actually. Don't mind the highlighted portion. I'm not going to talk about that to save on time. But at the end of verse 2, he uses this metaphor of fire. For he, Yahweh, when he comes in the day of the Lord, he is like a refiner's fire, like fuller's soap. What is fire? This is this holiness of God, this holiness attribute of God. He's going to purify some things. That's what he's like. Okay, and then in verse 3, he says there's a refiner's fire and purified silver. So he's purifying things, but not metal, right? That's just the metaphor, not gold and silver. He's purifying the sons of Levi. Who are they? The priests. They were the Levitical priesthood. He's purifying them. Why does he have to purify them? They failed horribly 1,000 years before this. 1,000 years ago, they failed. Right from the get-go, they failed. The sons of Aaron, they were killed in the temple. The Levitical priesthood fails. So he has to refine them so they can bring an offering of true tzedakah, true righteousness to the Lord. But he's got to refine and he's got to purify the king too, because the kings have also failed. The whole system's failed. The whole system's in shambles. They've already gone into exile and come back. I mean, this place was totally trashed. He's talking about this king priest in the order of Melchizedek from Psalm 110 that we talked about a few weeks ago. He's talking about Jesus here. So when Jesus comes, he's going to be this refining fire, this holiness that is the real priest, that is the real king, that offers this tzedakah to the Lord. And then after that, after he gets this, then he can draw near to us for true judgment, for true justice, for true mishpat, as we talked about so much already. So only then can God draw near to us without killing us by his holiness, okay? After all of this purification, that's when that mishpat takes place. That's when that true justice takes place, okay? And then you get, at the end of this section, I don't have the whole thing up here, but at the end of the section you get both types of justice, right? You get, what does he say? I will be a swift witness against the sorcerers, against the adulterers, those who swear falsely, the oppressors, those who oppress the hired workers in his wages, the widows, the fatherless, the sojourners, the immigrants, the downtrodden, the disenfranchised people of society. That is retributive justice. He's going to deliver retributive justice to those people, just like the Egyptians. But what I don't have up here, the last part of chapter 3, he's going to give restorative justice to the sojourner, the immigrants, the fatherless, the widows, the disenfranchised. He's going to restore them, right? Just like the people of Israel when he brought them into the land. It's the same thing. It's a complete, comprehensive justice that he's going to deliver in the day of the Lord. That's what he's talking about, okay? And then in the last chapter of the Old Testament, this is the last line of the Old Testament, okay? He clarifies this messenger. He's going to be like Elijah, okay? It's going to be like a second Elijah that comes. All right? That's how the Old Testament ends. Isn't that amazing? That's how the Old Testament ends, with this coming day of the Lord, this much anticipated day of the Lord that's going to come. All right? And before I talk about how the New Testament begins, I just want to point out something that's sort of a cool fact. Notice the first day of the Lord in the top half of this slide. In the first day of the Lord, which everybody roots the day, even Malachi, he roots in Moses, right, in Exodus. God spoke to Joseph and saved a remnant. He did that in Genesis, right? The last half of Genesis. Then you get this 400-year period of silence where we don't have any record of God speaking to any prophets or any people. 400 years of silence. And then the book of Exodus picks up 400 years later, right? what happens? The day of the Lord happens. You get retributive justice and you get restorative justice. You get salvation and redemption physically for the chosen people of God and the chosen family of Abraham in particular. But, that's a metaphor for the people of God, the faithful remnant. Okay? So then how does the Old Testament end? You have God speaking to Malachi, the last prophet, in 400 BC. And then we don't have any record of God speaking to anybody until when? The day of the Lord. When Jesus comes in this day of the Lord and provides spiritual freedom and salvation to the people of... isn't that amazing? That's unbelievable, isn't it? I hate using that word, unbelievable. It's overused. But that is beautiful, okay? And it's a little bit... you sort of got to put the pieces together, okay? Sometimes the biblical authors assume that we're smart enough to put the pieces together. I hate it when they do that. Because... Yeah. Well, and it doesn't happen overnight. What does Psalm 1 say? Jackson? What does Psalm 1 say? Blessed is the man who meditates. But what's the second half of that? Who meditates on the instruction of God day and night. We meditate on this day and night. So how does the New Testament begin? Mark is the first gospel that we have a record of. At least that's what most scholars think. How does Mark begin his gospel? This is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. As it is written in who? He says Isaiah, but isn't it from Isaiah? Is he just tricking us here? He's being clever, is what he's doing. And you got to be smart enough. It took me a really long time to figure this out, okay, because I'm not smart enough. And I didn't figure it out on my own. I just got it from somebody else, just so you know. But what's that first line? Behold, I will send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way. Where's that from?
Mine says Isaiah 43.
Well, come on, Terry. We just read it.
I know.
It's from Malachi.
It's similar language to Malachi.
Yeah, no, it's the same exact language, almost, from Malachi and Moses, right? The first half of that quote, actually, is from Malachi, who's quoting Moses in Exodus 23. The second half of that quote, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his paths. That's the part that's from Isaiah. And he's doing something incredibly clever here. This is amazing. I don't know if you guys know about this. I just found this out, and I'm just really excited about it. Okay? I probably had too many energy drinks this morning. So what Mark is doing here is it's just so clever. He's saying that this day of the Lord, which is the good news of Jesus, the Son of God, this day of the Lord, this good news, has been written about in the prophets, from Moses to Isaiah to Malachi, the first to the last, the beginning, the middle, and the end. All of the prophets, all of them have talked about this. The day of the Lord, this coming day of the Lord, about Jesus of Nazareth, is saturated in the prophets. Isn't that clever? That's exactly what he's doing, isn't it? I think it's amazing. And if you think about the dates there, Moses, 1400, Isaiah, about 700, and Malachi, about 400. That divides up just, it almost seems intentional. But, do you think that's a coincidence? I don't think that looks like design to me. So right from the first line of Mark, he has us anticipating this day of the Lord, when Yahweh will come to defeat evil and personally dwell with his elect, heal the land, reunite the heavens and the earth, so on and so forth, already as outlined by all of the prophets, first to last, Moses to Malachi. Okay? Then he introduces the forerunner. And we should expect that because that's what Malachi was talking about. This forerunner comes first, right? Who's the forerunner? Malachi said it was Elijah, right? The prototypical prophet as described in the book of the Kings, right? But then he says, no, it's John. It's this guy named John the Baptist. But he describes his clothing and his diet just like Elijah. So he's doing something else really clever, right? And what's John doing? It looks like he's preparing the way. He's proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. He's not forgiving sins. He's just saying, hey, look, guys, it's coming, right? He's preparing the way. He's lifting up the valleys. He's putting down the mountains, right? He's making the path straight, right? Metaphorically, that's exactly what he's doing. So, and the people come from all over the place and confess their sins. Now, look at the last line of this that I got here for. This is going to be important in a few minutes. Verse 8. I have baptized you with water, but he, the Lord, coming, is going to immerse you in the Holy Spirit. This is going to be important in a little bit, Terry, which is what you were talking about last week in the book of Acts. Okay, this is totally related to that. I mean, it's all related to it. It builds off of it, but this is intimately related to that. Okay, so then what's going to happen? What do you think is going to happen next? If we've been reading the prophets, what happens after the forerunner in the day of the Lord? Who comes? The Lord, yeah, the Lord comes. Yahweh comes directly, doesn't he? In Exodus, it was a pillar of fire and a smoke, right? And then he filled the tabernacle with his presence, and Moses couldn't go in. And then he filled the temple in the day of Solomon, but he came directly, right? In all of these previous days of the Lord. So Mark has us thinking, man, I think Yahweh's going to come, right? But the next line, verse 9, in those days Jesus came. Now that's clever from a literary perspective, isn't it? He has us anticipating one thing, and then he introduces a man, Jesus, right? I mean, if we know our Bibles at all, we know this day of the Lord is when Yahweh comes. So, but then Mark does something equally as clever. He gives us all of these stories describing Jesus doing the things, the specific things that only God has done in the Old Testament. We get a whole bunch of these stories in the first third of his gospel, doing all of this stuff that only God knows. And we know that only God knows. And the pinnacle, I think, the most obvious point, the most clever point, is when Jesus, in chapter 2, Jesus heals the leper that's lowered down from the rooftop. And before he heals him, he says, your sins are forgiven. Pick up your mat and get out of here. You have these Pharisees and scribes, these really holy, righteous men, with good intentions, maybe, some of them at least. We know some of them had good intentions. They were like, who can forgive sins but God alone? And when Mark's writing that, he's probably just laughing to himself. He's like, man, that's a good one. He's like, they're going to love this. Isn't that clever? Isn't that a good one? Who can forgive sins but God alone? He's like, exactly. What am I trying to tell you? All of these stories about him feeding people in the wilderness and walking on the water and hovering over the water and all of the stuff that we've already been talking about. Who can forgive sins but God alone? And Mark's like, exactly. That's a rhetorical question, isn't it? I mean, that's amazing, isn't it? What a way to tell a story. You see how these apostles and prophets, they're like literary geniuses. They're like literary ninjas. I think they were also geniuses, yes. But yes, exactly. I think it was both. Hold on a second. And this is exactly how Peter begins his gospel, or begins his sermon in Acts chapter 2. This is what, we finally got there, Terry. Thank goodness we're there. It took a while. But how does Peter begin his gospel sermon on the day of Pentecost? What is this a quote from? In the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on the people. What's that from? Joel. Is it from Joel or is it from Mark? It's from Joel. It's a direct quote from Joel. From that part all the way until the end of this. And it shall come to pass that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. But is it also from Mark? I'm sorry. What does John the Baptist say in verse 8? I have baptized you with water, but he will immerse you in the Holy Spirit. That's exactly what he's talking about. That's what John the Baptist was talking about, right? That's what Joel is talking about. And that's certainly what Peter is talking about. This day of the Lord. Okay? Now, okay, I said that. Now Peter decides to begin his gospel message right here in this day of the Lord as described in Joel, but also in some of the other prophets. Isaiah is in here, and Ezekiel is in here. Then he tells the people about the life and works of Jesus, right? And he roots that in the resurrection. Okay? So Peter is connecting this day of the Lord directly to the person in the work and the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth. But look how Paul does this later in the book of Acts. Okay? This is Paul preaching to the Greeks in Athens. He talks about this in a little bit different way. He talks about this eschatologically in a future day of the Lord, the second coming or the second advent of Jesus when he returns. He has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And has given insurance, right? Has given insurance to all by resurrecting him from the dead. Okay? And then Paul does a similar thing. Paul uses this day in the same way in Thessalonians. Okay? But it's the same thing. You see how it's the same concept? God making good on his promises, personally and directly redeeming his people while supplanting the wicked and delivering this comprehensive justice, right? Restorative and retributive, both types. Okay? This day of the Lord is when God fulfills his promises and makes good on his promises to his people that he's made in the past. But we're only going to understand that by rooting it in the way God has directly done that in the past, because it's the same way. It's the same thing. Okay? God works the same way. Now I'm going to skip a few slides here just to save on some time. I was going to talk about how this is used in Revelation, but I want to have enough in Ezekiel as well, but I want to have enough time to get back to Amos, so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Now, when Amos is describing this day of the Lord for us, he's connecting it directly to this day of the Lord in the past, but he's also pointing to the future. Okay? And you can see that in verse 20. Is not the day of the Lord darkness and not light, gloom, no brightness? So he's using this light, darkness motif, like many of the others. What's he talking about there, verse 20? Anybody?
Punishment? Judgment?
I got it up there, I think, don't I? Can you see that? The ninth plague? The ninth plague. What is the ninth plague? Ted? What's the ninth? It's probably darkness. That is deductive reasoning. Well done, my friend. Go ahead. Darkness. Yeah, that's darkness. The ninth plague was darkness, remember? Yeah. So he's doing it. That's where he's rooting it, right? So I don't even know what I was talking about. So, of course, I was talking about darkness. Yeah, it's right up there. The ninth plague of Egypt, right? That's how he's talking about this. He's rooting this day of the Lord, this coming day of the Lord, for the people of Israel in the previous day of the Lord. Okay, so this darkness and light motif. You know, when a lot of people think about darkness and light motifs as described in the Bible, who do we think about? What biblical author? Did anybody say John? John, yeah, very good. Yeah, you know how John opens his gospel with light, and he repeats it several times throughout his. He uses light and darkness motif all over the place. But really, Moses was the first one to do that, right? So look at this. Exodus 10, the ninth plague, right? Darkness came over all of the land for 3 days, okay? But all of the people of Israel had light where they lived, okay? 3 days darkness. What happened after the 9th plague? Say the 10th plague. The 10th plague happened after the 9th plague. What was the 10th plague? What was the 10th plague? Death of who? The firstborn. The firstborn son died after this 3-day period of darkness. Okay? So you see how this is the same story over and over again. I mean, this is just the same exact thing. Now, I'm going to explain that a little bit more.
Real quick, you kind of brought this out, but I think it's important that the darkness is on Egyptians, who are the ones that God is putting judgment on, and not on God's people who, in the story.
Well, yeah, I'm going to mention that in a minute. So hold on to that for a second. Yeah, and I said that. But all the people of Israel had light where they lived. Okay, that's important. So what you have is this dichotomy of light and darkness that Moses is giving us, right? You have metaphorical light, or no, you have literal darkness in chapter 10 for these people who are getting the retributive justice of God. That's followed by metaphorical darkness, which is the death of the firstborn son. Okay? Literal darkness, metaphorical darkness, which is contrasted with the light that is given to the people of God where they live. Okay? Now, notice if the people of God are in a different part, they don't get it. They just get it in the land where they live. Okay? Now, does that sound familiar? Where else have we seen something similar to that?
Crucifixion?
Yes, I'm talking about the crucifixion, of course. Right? In the crucifixion, you have 3 hours of darkness, followed by metaphorical darkness of the sun, right? You see how it's the same thing? It's the same thing, right? 3 hours of darkness, instead of 3 days, 3 hours of darkness, literal darkness. I mean, the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour, which is about 3 p.m. So for 3 hours, and then Jesus died at 3 p.m., okay? You had 3 hours of darkness followed by the death of the innocent son, right? Who did bad here? Who was the transgressor? It was Pharaoh, right? Did Pharaoh die? No. Who died? His son died. All of the firstborn son died. Yeah. So here, that's important. That's important in that way too. But that's also important. That's also important here because you have this literal darkness that's followed by the death of the firstborn. Okay, the death of the seed. Okay, it's the same thing. It's literally a mirror image. Just like the 400-year period of God being silent and then delivering his people with the day of the Lord. It's a mirror image. It's the same thing. Okay? This is quite amazing, and it's quite intentional. And it's a beautiful design, really. Do you see how we're given this contrast that's just is bright as day, really? And then to sort of piggyback off this light and darkness motif, come on. I'm giving you answers here. So now John, picks up this light and darkness motif, and he just fills in some of the holes, right? He just gives us a more complete picture. Light and darkness, who is Jesus to him? Who is the Word? Who is this Logos? He was the light of the world. He was the light of man. He was the true light which gives enlightenment or understanding or revelation to everyone, right? He is the true light that gives life. That's what this life is. This light is a metaphor for life, okay, and understanding and revelation. Now, this light was extinguished. This light of man was extinguished here on the cross for a moment before he was resurrected. right? There was a moment when that light took on the darkness. He took on the darkness of the Passover. That light took that darkness. Which the darkness is represented by the wrath of God, the holy and righteous wrath of God that was intended for the sin of man, right? But that light of John took that on when he was lifted up and given a crown of thorns, okay? And he took on that darkness. He took it on himself of the Passover, right? And don't forget that the light that the people lived in Israel, the people of Israel lived in light where they lived, right? That light was paid for with blood. Here, it was in Egypt, and in the history of Israel, it was paid for the blood of an unblemished lamb. But that's to give us a clue that the real light and the real life, that's going to be paid for with the blood of something else, okay? And the light of John 1 takes on that darkness of Exodus 12 and the Passover to give the people of God light spiritually and metaphorically, life. Okay? What is that called? What's the Bible word for that? Is that a broad question? Where the true light takes on the punishment that's intended for something else on himself. You remember?
The atonement?
Yeah. Should have been faster on that. It's propitiation. Okay? I don't care if you're if you're talking about Genesis or Revelation. It's the same story over and over again. This is amazing stuff.
You
Now,
haven't said anything about Christ being in the grave for at least parts of 3 days, and then after that's the resurrection. Do you think that's connected, the three?
I think it's all connected. Isn't it amazing? It's amazing, isn't it? Terry, I hope I'm just barely scratching the surface on this. You could stand up here and talk for the rest of time and not even scratch the surface on this. But yes, the answer is absolutely yes.
One quick other one. When Abraham and Isaac are going up to sacrifice Isaac, there was a 3-day period, if you count in Genesis, where Abraham knew he was going up to sacrifice his son. And at the end of that 3 days, he rose up off from that. There was a sacrificial replacement, the ram. That's a picture perfect of the 3 days and then the resurrection right there in that story. Yes, this is all through the Bible, like Lee's saying.
If you start counting the 3-day periods where there's a 3-day period and then some sort of redemption or salvation, it's almost too many to count. I mean, they're all over the place. They're in Leviticus. I think there was a 3-day period of that where David sinned, and then the plague that went through Egypt, and there was a 3-day period, and then life was given. That's what it was. It was 3 days of a plague, right? 3 years of fleeing from your enemies, 3 months of a plague or something like that? It was a category of threes. Hold on one second. Now, this is all intimately interwoven and connected together, and it all has to do with Amos. You see, Amos is trying to tell us about this coming day of the Lord, and he's standing right in the middle of all of this, but he's pointing back to Exodus, and he's pointing forward to the cross. Okay, he's pointing in both directions. He's not talking about the ram that was caught in the thicket, right? He is, but he's not primarily talking about that ram. He's not primarily talking about the animals that were killed in the garden to cover the sins and the transgression of the. Hey, Sherry, can you just for a minute, if you want to go in the back, okay? He's not talking about the animals that were killed in the garden and covering the sins and the transgression of Adam and Eve. He's not talking about directly the innocent son of David that was killed for his transgression with Bathsheba, or the 2 goats and the bulls on the Day of Atonement, the Passover lamb, the son of Pharaoh. He's not talking about any of that directly. What he's talking about directly is Jesus. Okay, that's what he's talking about directly.
That's why the theme of the entire Bible is that seed.
Yes.
It's the Son.
Yes.
All the way through. It's not salvation. It's Jesus. And that entire Bible alludes to.
The entire thing. And that's why Jesus is, when he says to his disciples on a couple of occasions, look, this whole thing, from Moses to the prophets to the Psalm, the entire thing is about me. Isn't that profound? The whole thing is about him. He opened his eyes to the Scripture. He opened their eyes that the Scripture was all about him. That is unbelievable. There's that word again. And he doesn't know. Amos doesn't know. He's talking about Jesus, right? He's talking about the antitype, and he doesn't know how God is going to bring this restoration. He doesn't know how God's going to bring this new day of the Lord, which is going to cause this true reconciliation in this comprehensive mishpat, this justice, this righteousness, and be able to dwell with his people directly, just like he did in Eden, and just like Joel talks about him doing in Zechariah and Malachi, just like all of that. He doesn't know how that's going to take place exactly. He's living on the other side of the cross. But what he knows is two things. One is God is faithful because of the past, because of what he has already done. He knows that God is faithful. And that this day of the Lord will come to pass and bring true righteousness and comprehensive justice. But he also knows that you can't understand what God is going to do in the future, in this coming day of the Lord, without having a firm grasp of what he has already done in the past. For example, Exodus. You got to understand that. Because it's all the same. It's all interconnected. And it's all the same story. It's all the same. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. It's all, you see how this is the same story as this. It's the same. Okay? You got to know what has already happened to understand and to have meaning about the miracles that Jesus is doing, right? Those guys, their hearts were hardened, probably for a lot of reasons, that they didn't understand those miracles. But you're never going to understand the meaning of the miracles if you don't understand what God has already done for his redemptive people in the past. It's the same story. Any questions about the day of the Lord? Go ahead. What were they? I forgot. Yep. That's exactly what it was. He divided it into three, didn't he? And he chose, obviously, what did he choose? Yeah. Remember that one, Ted? There's threes all over the Bible. You get 3 days of darkness, 3 days of death, 3 days of whatever, whether it's metaphorical darkness or it's literal darkness, you get 3. And then what happened after the 3 days of famine, or the 3 days of plague? No, what happened after, remember the angel of the Lord stood on that high point in Jerusalem and he stayed his hand. He didn't destroy the whole city of Jerusalem. And that's where what was that tribe? Jebusite or Jebusite? That's where that Jebusite owned that piece of property, the highest point on that ridge. Remember? What mountain? What mountain? Oh, so close. Mount Moriah. That's Mount Moriah. And that's where the temple was built. Any other questions about the day of the Lord?
You were talking in a positive way about all of this connects to show that it's all about Jesus and his sacrifice.
Yes.
I was thinking of what the negative is.
Well, the negative is obviously the retributive justice, right? Because he does both.
I don't mean that negative.
Oh, go ahead.
I mean people today. There's a fair number of people today in religion want to say that Jesus was not really God, that was not really dying on the cross for our sins. A consequence of saying that is in a sense to deny all of these references that are all the way through the Old Testament.
Yes.
To say that none of that
Yes.
is real.
Are you saying what is...
This was fulfilled
Yeah.
the way that God said it would be done. And
And are you saying what's the negative consequence of that?
Well, yeah, I'd say.
Well, what does Paul say in Thessalonians?
Well,
The day of the Lord is not over. There will be another day of the Lord.
there's judgment, yeah.
Yes. So,
And a number of people will be very, very surprised.
well, just think about what God has already done in redemptive history. Think about all of the people who lived in excess and self-fulfillment and self-gratification and pleasure-seeking in the days of Zedekiah and Manasseh and who was Jeroboam the first, Jeroboam the second. All of those days of wealth and they were sacrificing their children to Moloch, and they were transgressing. They were doing all sorts of horrible stuff. And some of those people, Terry, here's the tough part. Some of those people lived in wealth, they lived in self-pleasure, self-gratification, and that's how they died too. Okay? The day of the Lord didn't come in the day of Manasseh, right? He lived out a full life. I think he reigned for like 40 years or something, didn't he? So that's a struggle, but that's the way God works. That makes sense? Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead. What? What?
I think that was the word of something.
Oh, thank you. He has to say that, by the way. No, he doesn't. Oh, well, hold on. One more thing. We didn't get through. We didn't get through fully chapter 5 yet. If you notice, there's there's another paragraph. I'm not going to be here next week, so Bill is going to begin chapter 6 next week. And whenever I pick up, there's one more paragraph. Whenever I pick up the next, I'll just continue with chapter 5, and I'll just do the rest of chapter 5. So we're going to go out of order a little bit. So 2 weeks, okay. All right.